What if I told you that there is one thing that you're doing that is probably the single most influential way in which you are influencing how your life is presently? So, if you're kind of feeling stuck or feeling junky about life right now, there's probably one thing that you're doing that is most influencing that. But similarly, if you're feeling great about your life, if you're feeling peaceful and content about your life, it's the very same thing that you're doing that I think is most influencing that state of your life. It's interesting. This conversation that we're going to be having on the podcast today, it came up in the context of a recent consultation group that I was in with other therapists. And we were kind of exploring this phenomenon of how kind of energetically we draw things towards ourselves in our lives and are kind of up against the same kind of themes over and over, and how each of us thought about how that's occurring, why that's occurring, what's going on. And it reminded me of this topic, and I've talked about it or talked on it in other podcasts before, but let's dissect it today. So you keep listening. I know your deep, dark secret. You don't like your life. You're a woman in midlife, and for the past 2 decades or more, you've poured yourself in to other people. You've poured yourself into your career, your family, and yet on the inside, you feel broken. And that's no way to be. I'm Dr. Natalie Marr. I'm a clinical psychologist and a life transition expert. It wasn't too long ago that I was in your shoes, waking up in my early 40s, thinking I've got 2 failed marriages and I'm a single mom for the second time in my life. And I just knew that I could do better, that I could feel better. Fortunately for you, I have about 20 years experience clinically. And so I've created a method that will help you learn to love your story. I know that the story that you're telling yourself about your life feels awful. And I know that you think that you can't change that. I assure you, you can. And when we work together, I'm gonna help you to craft a different story, a story that you love, a story that makes you want to get up every single day. Let's work together to help you love your story.
Are you on my mailing list yet? Because if you're not, you really should be. You want to join at learntoloveyourstory.com. If you scroll down, I'm giving away a freebie for you. Honestly, you know what it is? A free course. I sell online courses, but this is a course just for you. And it's about freeing yourself, letting go of what others' expectations and ideas are for you. You know, that nagging self-doubt in your head, it's usually fueled by your consideration of what others think of you over your consideration of what you think of you. And so I teach you in my video all about what is underlying that kind of self-doubt and how to get out of that conundrum. And I give you a workbook that goes with it that helps you to build the skill sets that you're going to need for that. So please make sure you're on my mailing list, because at the least, you're going to get a free gift. And at the most, you're going to hear about all the things that we're doing on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving and learntoloveyourstory.com. And you don't want to be missing out on any of the new things that'll be coming your way.
Welcome back to Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving. So today we're going to be talking about this concept of how the story we tell ourselves is so influential that it indeed can kind of create a context around us. And if we're in a space in our lives where we're feeling stuck, we're feeling kind of blah about life, if midlife is going more towards the crisis route, if we're, starting to burn out and not like where things are at in our lives, that it might in large part be influenced by this story we tell ourselves about ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about us. And the idea of story, this has come up before because we've talked about how that's why I called it learntoloveyourstory.com, the website that I have with all of the resources that I put out there for you. Story is powerful, right? Story is so powerful. So I had a recent consultation group where this came up. We were talking about how, for some of our clients, what comes up is, that they're kind of up against the same themes over and over again in their lives. And each of us was kind of sharing our point of view on why does that happen, right? Is this, I won't get too down the rabbit hole of therapy speak, but some people are more on the psychodynamic side, psychoanalytic side. This would be the theory or way of thinking in therapy that was derived from Freud, from Sigmund Freud, like way back when. And kind of, some of the basic principles are there's kind of this unconscious mind that is witnessing everything that you're doing and hearing and seeing in your life, but you don't always have access to what's in that unconscious mind. Your conscious mind is kind of what you're aware is happening, but there's this other subliminal part of you that's kind of watching things. Now, I've broken that down before more into neurology, like your body mind is interpreting things, whether it's telling you it's doing that or not. And, so sometimes in that psychodynamic lane, we'll hear things like, well, of course, you're just going to keep repeating these same things over and over again until you break that cycle, right? You break that pattern in some way or learn what you need to learn from that life lesson. I think those are some of the ways in which we've heard that. There's a whole other school of thought that's called cognitive behavioral theory. And cognitive behavioral theory really talks about how the way we think impacts the way we feel and behave, right? Similarly, the way we behave and feel impacts the way that we think. It's kind of a feedback loop there. And so, the interventions in both of these theories are very different. Someone who's more on the psychodynamic side is looking at let's make you more self-aware, right? It's not unlike the things you hear me say on this podcast. Let's bring it into our awareness, why we're doing what we're doing, when we're doing it. Like what brought that pattern about for us? And on the cognitive behavioral side, we're looking at those thought patterns. What are those basic beliefs, those core beliefs about ourselves, right? Well, I think that there's a way to talk about this that makes a little bit more sense than the therapy speak that I just threw up on you on the podcast. I think that a better way to frame it, and I've heard other, sociologists and psychologists and social scientists talk about it this way, is what's the story you're telling yourself? What's the story you've been told about yourself? What's the story you've bought into about yourself? What's the story, right? Because the story guides the context. It really influences it very powerfully. In fact, you could be looking at the very same thing outward in your life, but if you're interpreting it through a story, it's like a lens that you're looking through, right? If it's green colored lens, everything looks one way. If it's a blue or pink colored lens, it looks a very different way. And you are in charge of the lens. You are in charge of the story that you filter everything through. And this is why I talk about it like it's a story, because I think that that's really powerful to think, oh, I'm the one that creates that, or believes it and buys into it and continues to tell myself that story. And so, yeah, maybe part of it is I have to unearth what the story is in the first place. Maybe the problem I'm having, we've talked about this on the podcast, is that I've been sold a story that is not helping me, not serving me in any way, shape, or form, because society does that, because our families do that, right? Because social pressures and social norming does that. It tells you should look a certain way, talk a certain way, be a certain way, have a certain job, live in a certain place. And those stories may not be serving us, but we may be buying into those stories. And again, the more we buy into those stories and kind of it just fades into the background, we start to think that just is what it is. It shapes the context of our life. It shapes these experiences that we're having emotionally, of feeling stuck, of feeling dissatisfied in midlife, of feeling like, man, you're looking around and this is all there is. Like, I did all the right stuff. Like Dr. Natalie, I checked all the boxes. I did everything I was taught to do. And I'm not feeling like so hot about my life. I mean, I don't hate it, but I'm not feeling so hot about it in midlife. And I'm kind of regretting that I didn't do this or I did do this. And now I'm in this boat. And like, there's not a lot I'm going to be able to do to change that. Well, all of that, in my opinion, is very much influenced by the story that we're telling ourselves about our lives, right? So I'm going to give you an example of how this has come up for me personally, but I'm also going to give you an example of how it's come up for a client of mine. And I think that both of these stories are really helpful in helping you understand how when we shift the story, everything can shift. So I'm going to read you something that I read on Instagram, and it's by, and I'll put her links in the podcast notes, but it's by the holistic psychologist is what she goes by. And her real name is Dr. Nicole LePera. She's written a book called How to Do the Work. She has a workbook on how to do your work. And she, helps people with very similar themes of feeling stuck, feeling overwhelmed, and gets very neurobiologically clinical about here's what's happening in your nervous system and here is why we need to help you clear your body mind. But she does these posts on Instagram every week, and one of them struck me, just really struck a chord because it was so telling of my own childhood, right? And it really explained some things about, why I did what I did when I did it, and why the story I was telling myself because of my upbringing had such a powerful impact that I was swimming in a context in my adult life that was just, it didn't feel great. It didn't feel great until about 5 or 6 years ago when I really started to tell myself a different story. So let me tell you what she posted. The parentified daughter believes her role is to fix everything and everyone around her. She keeps her depression a secret and fantasizes about meeting the one person who will finally see her for who she is, not how she can perform for them. That entry, it pulled me in, but there's more. The parentified daughter listened to marital problems, walked on eggshells, and did her best to manage everyone else's anxiety. No one noticed her own anxiety. She spent most of her time in her room, fantasizing about the perfect family she saw on TV. Now, yeah, and think about, I grew up in the 80s, early 90s. That's when I was really into watching sitcoms, and it was things like The Family Ties and The Cosby Show. I mean, it was, I had a huge family. There was a lot of us. There's 5 of us. So I did looking at family systems and the dynamics with brothers and sisters. And, I liked that because what I was seeing is resolution. I was seeing a beginning, middle, and end to here's a problem, fixed a problem, here's how it was resolved. Maybe there was a 2-part, maybe you had to tune in next week on Thursday night to figure that out. But I loved those kinds of sitcoms because that's what I wanted my family to do for me. And it was not happening for me at all. I was a very, very much a parentified daughter. But it doesn't stop here. Nicole LePera goes on and says, the parentified daughter had a huge part of raising her younger siblings. She was just a child, but she had to fulfill an adult role. She feels the guilt and shame of leaving those siblings behind, and the memories of not just her own emotional neglect, but theirs too. I got teary as I read this one. Some of hers are very powerful. They're more applicable to, coaching and clinical clients that I help. But this one, I just felt like she was speaking to my heart, to my experience, to my lived experience. And I very much have struggled off and on with the story that it was my job to take care of my younger siblings. That was what my parents doled out to me. And that I made selfish choices to go off to college, and I left them behind, and their lives started to disintegrate after that. Now, they were becoming teenagers. There's all likelihood that I was a horrible child parent because I was a child parent and not supposed to be their parent. I was a child. So there's all sorts of reasons why that happened. But in my head, there was a lot of guilt about that. And I told that story to myself, and I stuffed that story in shame away in the the back black parts of my brain and didn't admit it to myself for years and years of my adulthood. So I'm reading through this post on Instagram and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my life. And this was so important when I recognized this story had such influence in my life. When I got to just, 5-6 years ago after my last divorce, I was like, no, we're going way back. We're looking at all the stories I've been telling myself, because I am not telling myself these stories anymore. They do not serve me. Not one little lick do they serve me. Still not done. Nicole LePera goes on and says, the parentified daughter never had a parent attuned to her emotions. No one mirrored her own reality back to her. So she's still confused about what she wants and who she is, her entire sense of self. Whoa. Like mic drop, right? Oh, you guys, I heard this or read this rather. I read this and I was like, yeah. Because even though I've started to tell myself a different story, I was like 43, 44 as I started to tell myself that new story. Like I still am struggling with, do I know what I really want? And so many of my coaching and clinical clients, same thing. In midlife, if you're feeling stuck or you're looking at midlife crisis down the barrel, there is a high likelihood that this is a concept that you're struggling with. Now, the parentified daughter isn't the only way in which this becomes a thing, becomes manifest. But definitely when you didn't have a caregiver in your life or a safe adult in your life that could reflect back your emotional state and what we call co-regulate with, it's like they demonstrate regulating and taking care of your emotions with you so that you learn to do that for yourself. One of the deep-seated real traumas of that is you don't learn to identify what created that dysregulation in the first place. You don't recognize your own emotional states. You don't realize that this happened and I felt this way and that means this. You just start telling yourself the story that nobody sees you, that you don't matter, that your emotional state is not important. Parentified kids, and myself included, also sometimes have a layer where they're now responsible for the adult and their emotional experience of your emotions. So I got dysregulated. My parents amped. They didn't meet me and regulate me. They were like, how could you, blah, blah, blah. And, they got big or they got emotional or they felt awful as parents. And I needed to stroke those egos in order to get out of that situation. So I not only was neglected, I not only wasn't seen or wasn't even identifying in myself why I was having an emotional state or what that was about. I was having to over anticipate their needs and regulate those to get out of the situation and to create, peace again, or what I thought was peace in my life, which really was just walking on eggshells, which Nicole LePera says in this posting. And yet there's still more. So then she says, the parentified daughter desperately wants to be loved by anyone who takes any interest in her emotional world. She doesn't notice red flags, or she overlooks them because a part of her is still that child trying to survive in dysfunction. Totally me, you guys, totally me. So growing up, as soon as somebody paid attention to me, like even in friendships, like early on, right? As soon as somebody paid attention to me, then I was all in. So I had this experience when I was in 6th grade, 7th grade. I think it was 6th. I had created a best friend group. Now, I moved in 4th grade. There's this weird phenomena in Minnesota. I gotta get a little background. So in Minnesota, if you were not in a friend group by 4th grade, you most likely, even in your adult life, even almost 50, will feel an outsider, even if you've lived here all your life since. There's this weird phenomenon where, like, if you knew us when we were all in kindergarten, then we're besties and we got your back. But if you didn't know us by 4th grade, then, we will like you. We'll be your friend, but you will always be an outsider. And I have not researched this. I'm not a sociologist or a social psychologist, so I can't speak to why that happens, but I can say it's definitely a phenomenon. And most definitely, I don't know if it's a Midwest thing, but it's definitely a Minnesota thing. So I got here right at the tail end of fourth grade. It was this very, very narrow window of if I could get liked then, like then I'd be in. But if it had been fifth grade by the time my parents had moved, it probably wouldn't have worked. And by the grace of whatever, I hit that narrow window, and I did start to have a friend group. And I also was in a very small class. My parents put us in Catholic schools. So I don't know, we probably had 20 kids in the class or something like that. And 2/3 of them are girls. So I was able to solidify friendships, in fourth and fifth grade. But by sixth grade, there was kind of a popular girl group that had pulled me in. And weirdly, one of the reasons why I was like, I was already kind of friends with these individuals, small class, right? I became part of this close friend group, though, because one of their other close friends moved to a different school for a couple years or a year or something like that. And so there was kind of a hole in the place of that friend. And so they were looking for somebody that kind of did those things, right? Well, I went right in, and I had my superpower of reading the room and knowing what other people needed and of me and all those things. And so I just kind of filled that space. This was a friend that threw slumber parties. I had a huge house with a huge basement. Of course, I'll do it, right? So that's what I started doing. I was the boisterous one. I was, the loud, funny one, whatever, the one that would do weird things and put herself out there for the sake of the group so the group could follow and do those things. And so I just kind of chameleonized into that role and thought I had made like my best friends for life, right? Well, then between the summers of like seventh and eighth grade, that friend was going to come back to our school, and I got dropped like a hot potato. I threw a couple slumber parties and then they'd come over. But unless I was making a big shindig, nobody was calling me every day. And this was like when you had the phone cords that like were 60 feet long, and you could like drag the phone into your bedroom and be on the phone for hours, or we would go out on our bikes and we'd be biking all summer long and blah, blah, blah. So basically I got dropped all summer, and it was like devastating for me, right? Now, this was probably one of my earliest memories of the experience of chameleonizing myself or becoming kind of inserting myself into a friend group to be what they wanted of me, and knowing that's kind of a red flag, right? Like I didn't know that prior to this, but boy, did I learn it in that. And I was much more sensitive to it in high school and college, but I still would find myself doing it a bit, like more knowingly doing it, right? So you go back to the change podcast from last week. I mean, I was more in chapter 3 where I'd be walking right into it, but knowing I was walking right into it. But yeah, like that's what I learned. And that is definitely one of the things that was happening in my marriages and in dating and all of those things. So you guys, this was so me. And I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, what? Like you are like speaking to me. My goodness. So here's how she ends this. I'm going to read 2 parts together and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So the parentified daughter then feels so much anger, but she represses it. She tells herself it wasn't that bad and smiles in public. She directs her anger out on herself through restricting herself, punishing herself for any mistakes, and being her own worst critic. To everyone else, she's the cheerleader. But the parentified daughter feels like her life is in a haze. She can't focus. She forgets things. And sometimes she watches herself scrolling for hours, but she can't stop. Her burnout from caretaking her entire life and her body is in freeze. That is why I found myself 5 years ago in another divorce. I was burned out from caretaking. I mean, I was doing it for a career. I was doing it in my personal life. I was doing it for my kids. And like when that whole thing blew up, one of the things that I realized is I am not doubling down on the caretaking thing anymore. My body was screaming enough, right? I was angry, but I was repressing my anger. And I knew that was not going to be my way out of this. I was going to have to rewrite the narrative, the story that I was telling myself about why I do what I do when I do it. So I read you all of this and I'm saying to you like all the way through, this is me. This is what I've struggled with. This is why I've struggled with this. But I bring it back to the idea of the story. So one of the things as you go through that you start to notice is the parentified daughter, tells herself the story that it's her responsibility to take care of other people over herself. Like, she doesn't matter. Other people matter always. She never matters. And that story is a powerful one and manifests and influences how we show up in all sorts of spaces in our lives. That was a basic part of that story that I really had to unravel. And I was aware of it. Like, if you go back to last week's podcast and we talk about change, I was heavily in chapter 3 by the time I hit 40. I knew I was doing this to myself, but I was not ready to walk around that hole. I wasn't even ready to entertain that there would be a way to walk around the hole or another road. I just wanted to perfect the hole, the getting in and out efficient, make it more efficient to get in and out of the hole. I don't know. I was doubling down in that marriage, even though there were signs well ahead of time, my second marriage, that it was not, it wasn't good for either of us. It wasn't good for our kids. It wasn't good. Right. But I wasn't ready to not just keep going into that hole. I wasn't ready. And that's fine in my change process. But it was largely influenced by the fact that I still was telling myself the story that I don't matter, everyone else matters. And I must not be doing it right then. I must not be taking care of other people's needs well enough if things keep erupting and I'm still walking on eggshells. And so that's where I was. I was so heavily influenced by this story of being the parentified daughter. And I couldn't see red flags, or if I saw them, it was fine that I saw them. That might have been part of my trying to make it efficient, right? But I was going to keep walking into those holes over and over and over because I hadn't shifted the story. Now, where have I shifted that story? I matter most. Like, that is a new mantra for me. And it's one that I talk about on this series all the time. That selfish, right? Putting yourself first is actually the most selfless act that we can ever do as women. Because what really happens in my former narrative of everybody else is more important than me, and I need to take care of everybody else's needs over me, what's wrong with that inherently is I get destroyed. I get burned out. I get like I was a vegetable by the time I hit 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I couldn't do it. I couldn't put one foot in front of the other and even go down that sidewalk and fall in that hole. I was done. I was baked. And how am I helping anybody, right? How am I even helping caretake in that dysfunction? I'm not, right? And so what really I needed to do was shift my story. I had to be careful what I was saying to myself, right? So when I would notice the old urges pulling me in, let's say I had a client that, really needed to see me, and yet their life was super complicated and they didn't have the times at the times that I had, like, I would bend over backwards and find a time in the schedule. I would do therapy at 7 a.m. I would do therapy at 7 p.m. on the same day. Bad idea, people. That's not healthy. I didn't have boundaries around work time versus family time versus my time. I didn't have any time, but I didn't have any boundaries. I was boundaryless. So all of that was fed by this narrative that other people are my responsibility and I am last, always last, don't matter. I don't matter. Everyone else matters and I must take care of them. So the only antidote to that really I could see is that I have to take care of me first. It's always me first. And I'm always the most important, because if I take care of me and I am really the most important piece in all of this, then what I'm going to notice is that I take care of anything that I put my mind to better, including the people. So I haven't really shifted caretaking. I haven't shifted being flexible, right? That's a skill set that was born out of everybody else is more important than me. But listen, of course, I needed to become flexible as a part of that. However, I didn't give up flexibility when I put myself first, because now I'm just better preserved. And when I choose to be flexible, way better equipped to actually do it and do it on the spot, right? Like that, you guys, this is such an amazing shift for me. This idea of be careful what you're telling yourself, what story you're telling yourself, and really rewrite that narrative, because it simplifies things in such a way that you can kind of bring it back to a mantra, but then it also allows and lends into, and I'm going to have to figure out in this instance in my life, like work life, how does it look to put me first? Oh, I'm not seeing 30 people a week, and I need to decide the kind of clients I want to work with and the kinds of therapy that I really enjoy and that brings joy to me, because the counterbalance in the work that I do as a coach and a clinician is, it takes a lot out of you. And so that's a boundary. I need to preserve and hone the skills that I have, right? At home, it looked like I didn't take up any space. Like literally in my house, I didn't take up any space. I didn't have space. I didn't have things. I didn't have I had things, but it was all in service to what I was doing as a caretaker. And so I needed to take up time in my family's week. I needed to say no to things that I wasn't I don't want to be part of that. Right? I get to have time for me. I need to, I mean, it was partly a boundary at work, partly a boundary or self-care for me, but I love walking. I actually enjoy it and it resets me, but I would just never have time in the week. When I was in my work week, I don't have time. So one of the things, this new you put you first mantra allowed space for me was to kind of think about then what gets cut? Because going for a walk, super important to you. That's a non-negotiable. So we're going to have to figure that out. Something else is going to fall off the plate. If you don't have time, you got to cut something out to make that time because it's that important. And then once I started doing that, man, all the things started to come together in a very different way. It was a reset button. I had more energy. I actually ended up being much more productive in my work days. Amazing stuff came out of that. So I wanted to bring this up today because I also had this come up in the context of a coaching client. Now, for her, what we were looking at is, what was getting in the way of effective self-care? And the conversation had started around this idea of, maybe it's the types of self-care. I've about that in other self-care podcasts where I kind of go through, there are different neurotransmitters that are released. I'll put a link in the notes to the podcast where I've talked about that. So we started there. We were just trying to uncover, is it just not effective types of self-care? But it really became clear to me there's something about the story she's telling herself around self-care, that self-care has become another to-do list check mark. And that's part of an old narrative of I have to get everything done. I am responsible for everything on this to-do list, and my worthiness is from all of them getting checked by the end of the day. And so it was counterproductive to any kind of self-care to add something to this long to-do list, right? What she really needed more, if you're looking at type of self-care, was boundaries and prioritization of her stuff over any other stuff on that parentified daughter kind of to-do list that gets put together. But she had a very similar narrative, a very similar story that she had been handed as a child, being parentified in her family, that she was didn't matter. Her stuff didn't take up space, shouldn't take up space, but everybody else's should. And part of, what went into this reflexive, I have a to-do list and I need to get it done, that then was interfering with her ability to really layer in self-care in the way that I teach it in my online courses and in group coaching and in individual coaching. Well, that was the real issue, that the story she tells herself needed to shift. Similar to what I've talked about today about how I, in my own life, have shifted that to you are the most important thing and that you come first. Because in doing that, everything about my life has gotten better. My burnout has gone away almost. I mean, let's be real. I'm a single parent and an entrepreneur and other things, but I mean, way diminished and actually transformed, right? The burnout is really, I just desire to have a lot of things that I want to get done, but I am not compelled to take care of others because their worthiness is more important than mine. That's what the narrative of my childhood did. That is what the narrative of this coaching client's childhood did. And so until we stop telling ourselves that story, nothing will shift. All the contexts of our life still are getting filtered through that story and still feel terrible. my coaching client has more things on her to-do list now that we've been talking, since, uncovering this than ever. But she too has found that by like flipping the narrative and she really is most important, part of what that is there's more for her in that to-do list. And when she's taking care of herself and putting herself first, she is more productive, just like I found. Like, it's amazing how you just find energy stores. It's like it breeds energy, right? It creates more. I don't know what the phenomena is with that. We'll go back to, I was, talking about this in this consultation group of mine. And I'm like, I've just seen people switch that narrative. You can call it bringing it into self-awareness, that there was an old, way of thinking about the world. It's kind of a combination of both of these, CBT and psychodynamic points of view. You can say that's what it is, but energetically, it just, then all of a sudden the opportunities start coming people's way. It feels a little bit more like a quantum physics kind of a deal, like the force of energetically applying this new lens on everything makes the hard things not feel as hard, makes the good things for you more plentiful, and just adding exponentially to your energetic level. It's an interesting phenomenon to watch and to feel happen in your own life. So I leave you with today's podcast. I leave you with just the challenge of uncovering, what are the stories you're telling yourself about you, or have been for a long time, or were taught to and just accepted and have continued to tell yourself all through the years? What are those stories? And do they really serve you? Do they really serve the values that you have? Do they really serve the people that you want to serve in your life? Because I don't know that they do. If you're feeling stuck and blah and don't like your life, or are in the midst of a midlife crisis, I don't think these narratives, I don't think these stories serve you. And I think you need to stop listening to them, and you need to rewrite them and come up with ones that do serve you and that do help you filter your life circumstances and context through them in such a way that you're living a life that feels centered. Because that, my friends, is how you will find peace and contentment and joy and all of the things that you've been searching for online with these self-help podcasts and books and things of that nature. That is how you're going to find that centered life thriving. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741. to the crisis text line. You can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.